Hey, good morning. I'm going to give you a brief analysis or a summary and analysis of Chapter 7. First, I'm going to go through the main story points that happen in Chapter 7, and then I'll go through page by page for my students so that you can see the important character information that I've highlighted, the vocabulary words that I have highlighted, the figurative language that I have highlighted, and the information on the conflict or themes that run through this chapter. So first, let's look at a summary of what is happening in this chapter. First, here we have Stacy. I have a picture of a young man wearing a coat that's slightly too large for him. So we're going to call this Stacy, and then we're going to call that guy over there Uncle Hammer. In the beginning of this chapter, we have an incident with Stacy and the coach, and Uncle Hammer is trying to teach Stacy some rather difficult life lessons, and Mama doesn't quite agree with the lessons that Uncle Hammer is trying to teach, but she does defer to him, and we see what happens with Stacy in that coat. Let's suffice it to say that Stacy will no longer be wearing the coat anywhere in the story. So here I have Stacy again, and this time he is without the coat, or at least a depiction of a young African-American male dressed in 1930s clothing. So the next thing that I have here, and this is once again in no way, shape, or form the family, it's just a depiction of a rundown or, poor family's cabin in the 1930s as they get ready to celebrate Christmas, because there is quite a bit in this chapter that has to do with the celebration of Christmas. The characters aren't right or anything in this. It was just an interesting depiction, but the chapter does go on for a little bit and talk about Christmas. We learn a lot more about the institution of slavery as it pertains especially to Mr. Morrison and his family. That is interesting and kind of sad. The family goes to church, and we are reminded again that while this family, does do things like have the shoes with holes in the bottom and things like that, the family also is making sure that the land is something that they don't lose. So they have set their priorities. Instead of repairing their home or making sure the kids have new clothing, they have set their priorities to being keeping that land and making sure that the children have a legacy that outlasts the parents and the grandparents. Then the next thing that I have here is part of this celebration of Christmas. We have Jeremy Sims who shows up, and Jeremy has been throughout the story. We have seen Jeremy not quite agree, I guess, with how the other people around him feel about the African Americans in the community. Jeremy comes over and offers a gift to the family, and then we have a little bit of an indication of, and a little bit of foreshadowing as well, of how the adults in the family feel about Jeremy, even though Jeremy is trying very hard to be a friend to the family, or at least the children in the family. The adults have concerns about the two races in the 1930s being friends and whether or not that is possible in the circumstances that they live in. So I kept that, I put this picture in there as a reminder or to look at that part of the chapter. The next thing that I have here deals once again with the theme of making sure that the land stays in the family and stays protected and stays safe. We have Mr. Jameson, and Mr. Jameson comes in and out of the story a couple of times. And Mr. Jameson is a lawyer, and we learned that earlier in the story, we learned that Cassie respects Mr. Jameson because he's the only one who uses a nice title when dealing with his family members. Even though he is white and the family is black, he doesn't seem to let that bother him at all. And he, in this chapter, is very supportive of the black community and wants to make sure that they have the ability, at least, to no longer be under the thumb of the Grangers. So there's a whole section in here on Mr. Jameson and a plan that they're coming up with to try to get out from underneath that system. And then finally in here, the last real section of this chapter deals with another Silver Packard driving up to the family's home. And in this case, the scene is between Mr. Granger, Papa, and Uncle Hammer. And Mr. Granger is threatening the family, and Papa and Uncle Hammer are trying their best to handle that situation. And that pretty much takes up the rest of the chapter. So now I'm going to switch over to going through page by page so that my students can mark all the important parts of this chapter. Okay, so in chapter 7, and a lot of this information will be kind of repeated from what I was just telling you guys. First of all, we have a vocabulary word here. And then the information I have here highlighted, this is about Stacy and the coat, and has to do with the lesson that he is going to learn about that coat. I did say that Mama and Uncle Hammer have different reactions to what happened with the coat, and we see that on this page. So I have a section here for Mama. I have quite a bit here for Uncle Hammer and his response and the lesson that he is trying to teach Stacy. We have a vocabulary word here, apprehensive. And this is a metaphor or an idiom, kind of both. A metaphor in the comparison that's being made between the way that Uncle Hammer is dealing with Stacy and it's called a tongue lashing, and we know what that means. That's why I say it's an idiom, because if somebody says that somebody's getting a tongue lashing, we understand what that means. So it's an idiom. It's a word that doesn't mean exactly what it sounds like it means. The next page, I have a couple of vocabulary words highlighted. I have interminable and flounce. And then we have this superior smirk. We have Lily and Jean going past Cassie with a superior smirk. And that is definitely an alliteration meant to draw attention to the way that she's being treated, the way she's acting. Stacy over here, this is part of the lesson that was learned at the beginning of the chapter. So we have Stacy over here. It says that he learned from his mistake and became stronger for it, and he's not going to blame others for his own stupidity. So even though he was kind of taken advantage of by TJ, he knows that it was his fault that he allowed that to happen, so he can't do much about it. Then I have a metaphor. This is a gigantic coon, which Mr. Morris and Uncle Hammer and Stacy had secured in a night's hunt baked in a sea of onions, garlic, and fat orange yellowed hams. So we have the dish that's on the table being compared to like an ocean or a sea, it says, with all this stuff. So we can just kind of imagine what that looks like given that metaphor. In the heart of the house is another metaphor. It's the kitchen is being compared to a heart, in that it's what makes the family. It's a place where the family gathers and eats and shares and stuff like that. So it's a metaphor. Look at this. I have a whole page with nothing highlighted. Then we go one more page, and I have wary highlighted as a vocabulary word. The next line down here says swept down like locust. So that is a simile because it's a comparison made using like or as. Over here we have some information about that theme or the conflict, both either or, that run through the story that deals with racism. And it's talking about a system that they call breeding slaves, which were slaves that were coupled together and stuff that produced children that were stronger. So this is a practice that I didn't really know about. It makes sense that they did it, but it was a practice I did not know about until I read this story. So this is talking about the theme again of racism and how that played out. in the United States. Then I have a simile. They fought them demons out of hell like avenging angels of the Lord. So I marked it as a simile because that's the most obvious. The avenging angels is the word avenging is one that I highlighted there as a vocabulary word. And the next paragraph, I have a personification. Big Ma poked absently at the red-eyed logs. Obviously, the logs don't have red eyes. They don't have eyes, so that's a personification. The next one, I have a metaphor. Visions of night men and fire mixed in a cauldron of fear that awakened me long before dawn. So this is talking about how the thoughts in her head are being compared to like a cauldron, so a great big cooking pot outside. That when we think of cauldron, a lot of times we think of like the witches stirring a pot. That's a cauldron, but it's a cauldron of fear that awakened her before dawn. So a really strong metaphor there, really strong comparison being made. Then on the next page, another idiom. We line their pockets. We know that we're not talking about a lining for your pocket. We're talking about putting money into someone's pocket. So that is an idiom. Next page, I have two vocabulary words. I have collateral and mulatto. Mulatto is just kind of a term. It's not used anymore. Hasn't been used in a long time, but you do need to be aware of what it is. So I went ahead and highlighted that as a vocabulary word. Over here we have the theme of conflict and money, or the theme or conflict of money. And this is where the family is talking about how important their land is. And they're trying to figure out how to get out from underneath the grips of that system that's in place with the Granger store. And they're trying to find a way to do that without putting up their own land, because there's a possibility that they could lose the land. So money and land kind of go together a lot throughout this story, and it becomes more apparent as the story goes on. Down here, we have Papa, and he is assuring Cassie that we ain't never going to lose this land. You believe that? So still on that theme of land and how strongly Papa feels about that land. The next page, I just have a couple of vocabulary words highlighted. I have aroma, I have timid, and I have indication. Make sure you get those highlighted so you can find them. On the next page, I have malevolently. Good word. I like that word. Then down here, I have, it says, but for me, somebody gave me something, I'd want it to be something fine, like that pretty little pearl-handled pistol. So I have that highlighted as TJ up here, but it is also foreshadowing that pretty little pearl-handled pistol has come up more than once so far in this story. So we know it's going to kind of be a thing. Down here, then I have Stacy, and he's talking about his friend, or not friend, TJ, and he's also talking about Jeremy. So this kind of deals with what I was talking about earlier, with Jeremy making a visit, and then how the family is concerned about what happens in the 1930s if there's a friendship between blacks and whites, what that could lead to. And Stacy's really not concerned with Jeremy being that way. And then over here we have more of that theme of racism when we're talking about the whites and the blacks and them trying to be friends. And remember, all this is because it's in the 1930s. It's nothing that is relevant today as to how people feel about each other, but it was relevant in the 1930s. And that's an important thing to remember about historical fiction, is that it teaches us about the past. Two more vocabulary words, lingered and summoned. This one I made a mistake in my highlighting. It should be yellow, and the character would be Big Ma. And this is talking also then about the conflict or theme of money. This is one Mr. Jameson comes back into the story. But anyway, here we have Big Ma is concerned about the land and wants to make sure that there are no problems when she passes away, that the land passes on the way it's supposed to her children. And the conflict and theme of money is in here too. While I'm breathing, they gets the title of this place under the law with no trouble. Don't want a whole lot of problems when I'm gone. So she's worried about that land staying where it belongs, that they worked so hard for. We have 3 vocabulary words: placid, affirmed, and wry. And now we have Mr. Jameson and Uncle Hammer. And we have Mr. Jameson. We're finding out more about his character when he says, "I'm a Southerner, born and bred. But that doesn't mean I approve of all that goes on here." And there's a lot of other white people who feel the same. So, Uncle Hammer is a little concerned about that comment and wants to know what he means by that. And they kind of go back and forth a little bit here. So I have Mr. Jameson. The theme of money and racism, or the money and the land, goes all the way through this whole page. So that's a page to definitely make sure that you read and understand. An oxymoron, a grudging respect. So an oxymoron is like 2 words together that don't make a lot of sense, really. So grudging is something you don't want to do, but respect is something that is earned. And the term grudging respect can definitely be an oxymoron. You may, as a student, you might have a grudging respect for a teacher. Somebody who's really hard on you, makes you work really hard to get the grade or to earn the grade, but they're teaching you a lot at the same time. So even though you're working hard, you have a respect because of the information that they're teaching you. That might be something you have a grudging respect for. On the next page, I have a vocabulary term, eviction, highlighted. Then down here at the bottom, we have more on that theme of money. And this is still Mr. Jameson, and I'm trying to figure out how to get out from underneath the holds, or the stranglehold of the Grangers, and to help other people do the same thing. So that's the main theme really in this part of the chapter. The next page, I have more on the theme of racism, and this is talking about what it's saying when they're trying to get underneath this stranglehold. And then down here it says, now that is what Harlan Granger absolutely will not permit. So we know there's going to be trouble. More on Mr. Jameson. When Mr. Jameson is saying no matter what you do at this point in time with the system that exists, that you can't get out from underneath them. Not everyone can. And then over here we have Papa saying, I want these children to know we tried. And what we can't do now, maybe one day they will. So a lot has changed in these almost 100 years since this story was, since the events in this story happened. And, people who made a little stand then were part of what made the changes that we see in our world today. Personification down here, it says, when the silver Packard glided to a smooth stop in the drive. Well, it's hard for a silver Packard to glide anywhere. It has to be driven and brakes applied. It's not something that the car is doing. It's something that the driver is doing. So that's personification. Next page, I have 2 vocabulary words, dialect and protrude. And then we have Uncle Hammer. And he is talking to Mr. Granger, and that is the main crux of the main storyline in the rest of the chapter. So I have several things highlighted that show that very strong personality that Uncle Hammer has. So for example, here he says, ain't gonna lose it, said Uncle Hammer flatly. He's talking about the land, and Mr. Granger is threatening that land. And then down here, Uncle Hammer's laughing outright at Mr. Granger. The next page, then we have Uncle Hammer in several places, and we have Papa. And Papa is showing that he stands behind everything that Uncle Hammer is saying through these things that I've highlighted for Papa. Papa leaves home for several months a year to go and work to make sure that there's money to pay the taxes on the land so that they don't lose the land. This is an important thing to this family. They are going to keep this land. They are not going to fall victim to that sharecropping system. They're going to make sure that their children don't have to either. And then I have 3 different vocabulary words highlighted. I have insolently, condoned, and carpetbaggers. So if you look up, for example, insolently, you'll be looking up insolent. But when you write your sentence, make sure that you do write it as an adverb. Insolently is an adverb, so make sure that you use the correct form when you do write it in your sentence. And then finally, the last page of this chapter is some more of that Papa. And this one, I love this image here. It says, Papa impaled Mr. Granger with an icy stare. Then you better make them good, he said. And this is Mr. Granger has threatened Papa, and Papa is having nothing to do with it. So that's the end of chapter 8, or chapter 7, I mean.